Hi, fools. We're thrilled to welcome Scott D. Anthony, a clinical professor of strategy at Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business and an acolyte of the legendary Professor Clayton Christensen. His powerful new book, Epic Disruptions, explores 11 innovations that shaped our world and positions disruption as the engine of progress. Named one of the world's most influential management thinkers by Thinkers 50, Scott's insights are essential for navigating the turbulent landscape of exponential change we're facing today. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for the kind introduction.
Yeah, I read this book and it was great. Epic disruptions couldn't be timelier. We often talk about innovation here at the Fool with the companies that we're looking to research and pick for our members. But you and your mentor Clayton Christensen defined disruption in a very specific way. You described it as an engine of progress or like an unstoppable force. So for our members, how do you define disruptive innovation? And critically, why is it so important for investors and organizational leaders to understand the mechanism behind it? Like, that's not just about the fall of the old, but also but the rise of what comes next.
You've got it exactly right. And it is a really critical thing to understand if you're trying to decide which company is going to thrive and which company is going to struggle. So let me answer your question by doing a quick tour through history.
Yeah.
My father was born in 1947. That year, there was one computer in the world. It weighed 20 tons. I was born in 1975. Now there are tens of thousands of computers, but I would never see any of them because they're locked inside great big organizations. They're complicated and expensive. When my daughter Holly is born in 2007, there are hundreds of millions of computers, desktops, laptops that anyone can access. And of course, that was the year Steve Jobs and team introduced the iPhone.
Yeah.
Today, there are billions of computers in our palms and in our pockets. This is disruptive innovation, taking things that were complicated and expensive, making them simple and affordable, changing market dynamics, driving explosive growth. You're on the right side of it, you're driving tremendous growth. You're on the wrong side of it, very different story.
Yeah, yeah. So, we were taught that the great firms fail in the face of disruption precisely because they're doing everything right. They listen to their best customers. How can listening to your best customers, be an inaccurate guide, when the world is going to flip around you? Using the example of Kodak, which you had in your book, they saw digital coming, but what got them was missing the merging of cameras and mobile phones.
Exactly right. And the challenge you have is that the people who love you the most give you the worst answers when you ask them about the future. So if you ask somebody who really loved the texture of how an Eastman Kodak print would look on silver halide film, they're not going to tell you, I want a reasonably crummy digital facsimile, or I'm going to go post on this thing called Instagram, which emerged in 2012. They're telling you, I love what you do. Can you do more of it? Or imagine you're Apple in 2007. You've got a team that's been working on this phone. There's a voice in the ear of Steve Jobs that says, don't do it. We've got a great personal computer line. We've got a great laptop line. And don't forget, they had this MP3 line of players, the iPod, that was churning off all sorts of cash. It might feel to some that the disruptive approach is cannibalistic. But the thing that's so powerful about disruption is it unlocks markets. So even if it does cause you to lose at the margins, you win in the long run. But it requires a mindset that says, I need to think and act differently when change is happening.
Yeah, it was interesting you mentioned the book too. Kodak was on the verge of disrupting themselves. They did invest in digital cameras. They kind of saw it coming, but even with seeing it coming, they were, we don't hear about them much anymore. They weren't able to get that right merging of the technologies or right, fit to the customer.
And this is the thing that is so great about Clay Christensen's original research. One of the things that Clay taught me is ask great questions. That is the great way to get great insights. And his question was a doozy. His question was, why is it that great companies fail? That's interesting. If you ask, why do stupid companies fail? Well, it's because they're stupid. But great companies doing everything that seems to be right, Eastman Kodak invests early in digital imaging, moves early into online platforms when it buys OPhoto, one of the early photo sharing sites. It's really hard though. Kodak got over gate number one, allocate resources to the disruption. they failed at gate number two, which is reimagine your business in the face of that disruption. And that's hard because you have a long, successful past of being a certain company. That creates a lot of powerful things, but also creates what I call in the book ghosts that can haunt your ability to change. Kodak's identity was so tied into film that when it had that site, O Photo, rather than embracing the disruptive power and essentially creating Facebook or Instagram well before anyone did any of that, they said, how do we get more people to print more pictures? Which in hindsight was the wrong thing to do.
Do you think sometimes these companies kind of like limit themselves when they're too good at that one thing? Like they focus so much on that one thing. Like Nokia comes to mind. They were the king of mobile phones. Everyone had a Nokia. They were global. No one thought they could be toppled off the pinnacle. But like if you remember the Nokia phones, like they're great phones when we used to talk on the phone. But to do anything else on them, they were terrible. Like to listen to music, to get on the internet, and as those technologies started coming into the digital realm and like into our form factors, they just couldn't keep up with that. Like I think BlackBerry too is another example where they had the BlackBerry, everyone like executives and stuff loved it. I remember having a BlackBerry and you're like trying to get on the internet and it was terrible. I remember downloading MP3s into the BlackBerry. It was like a complicated process, but they did phones well, but they didn't do other things well. So is it maybe better for these companies to do a lot of different things well? So then eventually if they can merge those things into something better, then they can succeed.
The first thing I just reflect on is, I teach at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, and I love to use the case study of research in motion struggling to respond to the iPhone. But my students have no appreciation for it because I ask them who had a BlackBerry and fewer hands go up. So it works really well with business executives, not so well with MBA students, but so it goes. I think the trick here is how you identify yourself in an organization. This goes way back to what Ted Levitt wrote about in the early 1960s in his classic article, Marketing Myopia. The challenge becomes when you begin to identify yourself, not just with the product you sell or the service you offer, but with specific feature sets. The people at Research in Motion were all about the physicality of the keyboard. That defined who they were, that defined what they did. You can't do that much if that's what you do. We make phones with keyboards that enable email.
Yeah.
If you say what we do is we enable communication, well, there's lots of different things that you can do with that. The more your identity is tied to features, the harder it is to change. Today, what I really worry about are the automobile companies that they won't exactly say this, but they're mechanical engineers that are organized around internal combustion engines. That's just who they are. You see the electric vehicles coming, particularly from China, but that goes against the real identity of many people inside the big auto manufacturers. And history shows identity is really hard to change. Not impossible, but really hard.
Yeah, that's a great point because when I first sat in a Tesla, did a test drive, I'm driving around the Tesla, I sat in it, very modern, very clean, not much in there. It almost felt like the iPhone of cars. And with the cars, you're exactly right. If these companies don't identify, if they only identify as a car, that's doesn't seem like what the future of cars is. It seems like it's a computer on wheels or a mode or method of transportation. Maybe even Tesla's working on being able to monetize your autonomous vehicle. So
yeah, for sure. I remember I lived in Singapore for 12 years back when I was a consultant before I became a professor. And I was on the board of MediaCorp, which was essentially the BBC done at Singapore size. And one of the things we were talking about is when cars go autonomous, and they will, exactly when, who knows, but they will. What does that mean if you're a media company? Because now drivers have to look at the road. When cars are autonomous, you've got screens all around you, and you could rethink what a car looks like, and you could do some really interesting things if you think early and you make the early investments so you're positioned to do it. A lot is going to change in the space that we now call automobiles in the next couple decades, and that will reverberate to lots of parts of the economy. It'll be exciting to watch and scary, I'm sure, for some people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was reading your book, the one reason that was such a compelling draw for me was, we have a strategy that was coined by our founder, David Gardner, called rule breaking. we look for rule breaker stocks that are innovative. One of the things is they're top dogs and first movers in emerging industry, and usually they're considered overvalued by like the traditional media. You are just in the book to focus on the movie, not the snapshot. The rule breakers can look very overvalued on certain metrics, but they have a lot of long-term potential, which are often overlooked because of the current snapshot of what the company is. Or even perhaps like the products that they're developing are kind of like toys. Like early Mac users were considered by DOS advocates. I don't know who might even remember DOS on this podcast, but
I do.
yeah.
There you go.
So like technology, just isn't enough. It has to be coupled with a business model to kind of capture the value. And you noted that current AI companies' business models are kind of banal and pretty boring. So why is the ability to kind of create, deliver, and capture value, kind of like Ray Kroc did with real estate and funding McDonald's, so crucial for like a disruptive industry, a company?
First of all, I have to really acknowledge and appreciate you just strung together something from the conclusion and a chapter in the middle of the book, which is a good sign that you got beyond
Oh
what
yeah,
often people get to. So I really appreciate that.
absolutely.
So, the thing that's really important here is if you look at the patterns of disruptive innovation, one of the kind of meta themes in the book is disruption is predictably unpredictable. The
Hmm.
business model is the real special sauce, how you create, deliver, and capture value. Why? Well, a product is a thing. A service is a thing. A thing is relatively easy to copy. Yes, OpenAI might always have a small lead over other frontier models in terms of performance, but we can see many people are figuring out the nuts and bolts of how you make large language models work. That's not the hard part.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard, but it's not the hardest part. What's really hard is saying, all right, how will we use this to create value in unique ways, deliver it in unique ways, and then go and capture the value ourselves? That's a system. The system has multiple parts that feed off each other. That's really hard to copy. You could copy an individual function on the Apple iPhone, but once the App Store kicks into gear and there's an ecosystem around it, it's really hard for anyone to credibly compete against it. And I think the same thing will happen with AI. Right now, you have some amazing technologies. I'm very grateful for them. The valuations are just crazy until someone figures out something that is defensible. Right now, people have not. And because of that, I think you're going to see the big model houses get absorbed into other players unless they can figure something out. We'll see.
But like you're saying too, like when the snapshot right now is the valuation of the companies, the way that the AI models kind of currently work. I think it was in one of I was listening to some of your other podcasts. You talked about how open AI and all these models just create a business model that's just another ad engine. Google became the best, pretty much business model in the world based off their ad engine. Is that how these AI models are going to function, or will there be another kind of unimaginable kind of revenue model that they might come out with?
And you'd imagine, if agentic AI is really able to deliver against promises, and some would argue, and I'm not a technology expert, but some would argue there are fundamental flaws in the technology that you never want to give too much over to AI because you get a small error rate on multiple tasks, it compounds, and that's bad. But if you're able to figure out actually getting stuff done, so, Google's business model is based on connecting people who want to get stuff done. I'm searching for something, you've got it. If you have a business model based on actually getting stuff done, that's really interesting. The other thing that I've become mildly obsessed with, I don't know the answer, but I know it's the place to look. Disruption history teaches us you always watch people who are competing against non-consumption. What does that mean for AI? Well, if we see someone use it now, like I watch my kid in ninth grade use it, the question for education is, will AI teach him better than his ninth grade instructor? You can debate that. If you've got someone in a country that has poor educational infrastructure, it's not, are they better than the ninth grade teacher? It's, are they better than nothing? And the answer is clearly better than nothing. So education and healthcare models that are emerging in parts of the world that don't have great school infrastructure and don't have great healthcare infrastructure, I think those are ones that are going to drive big disruptive growth. I don't know the names of companies doing this yet, but that's the place you got to watch.
Yeah, you mentioned education, and I have a 13-year-old. She's just started high school, and it's a new shift from middle school, and got to learn how to think better and take questions and answer them with more problem solving. these tools have learning modes where you can basically, it won't give you the answer, it'll help you think through so you can solve other problems. And for $20 a month, people around the world could essentially get a learning tool.
Absolutely. And it was a feature that I very much enjoyed as I was getting ready to do interviews like this. It's like
Hmm.
I did a lot of research for the book. I did a lot of writing for the book. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of facts. There's a lot of figures. There's a lot of questions people could throw at me. So I gave ChatGPT not all the book, but I gave it some of the highlights. And I said, I want you to throw random questions at me in tutor mode. And I want some of those questions to be factual, and I want some of them to be interpretive. And the ones that are factual, just tell me right or wrong. The ones that are interpretive, give me a score 1 to 10 and tell me what I could do to make it better. Turned it into voice mode and then had a conversation around it. And
Wow.
look, sometimes it was really off, bad, and stupid. And there was one time, a funny moment. I was going to meet somebody for lunch, and they asked me a question about McDonald's. The McDonald's before they launched the speedy service system. What kind of food do the brothers McDonald sell? At that moment, I pulled up to the parking lot entrance, and the automated voice says, "Please press the button to take your ticket." And ChatGPT's response is, "Not quite. The right answer is barbecue, but you did a great job." So that was his response to the parking ticket machine. Not there yet. But again, as you said, and I said in the book, not the snapshot, the movie, we know it gets better. It always does.
Yeah, still a lot of value though. So a lot of the companies that we look for too is good management, sustainable competitive advantages. And success demands patient perseverance, willingness to be misunderstood for long periods. So you emphasize looking at the edges and anomalies of a market. Given persistence required, like Julia Child's example, 10-year effort behind her book. Lots of challenges there. What kind of specific behaviors should investors look for in management that kind of signals that they can turn what starts small into something really massive?
Yeah, great question. So, of course, one big thing is demonstrated proof they've done it before. So, why
Mhm.
do we believe that Amazon.com can keep churning things out? Well, they've shown us through their original model and Prime and AWS and so on that they are able to take small things and make them big. And because of that, we give them a lot of latitude. Jeff Bezos would say Amazon is the best place in the world to fail because he knew and the organization knew that to have the big success, you had to have a lot of failures. And investors said, okay, we have seen demonstrated proof that you can actually make this work. So that's one big thing. The second thing is you watch where people are spending their money. If all of their investments are in what the disruptive literature would call sustaining innovations, things to make what currently exists better, even if it's a big technological breakthrough that they're working on, you're a little bit worried because you want to make sure that investment portfolio, yes, has a bunch of things that are about today better, but also has some things that are about tomorrow different. And then finally, I think you really look for the vision that the leadership team has.
Yeah.
If the vision is one that's about solving an important problem, getting an important job done, and there's multiple paths to get there, the equivalent of John F. Kennedy landing a man on the moon and bringing them back, you say, okay, this is a company that I think could do something really interesting. If it's about how do I make sure that I maximize my returns from the feature set that's in a product or service, they're going to get caught when transitions come. So those would be the things that I would look for.
I really love the discussion about just being misunderstood for long periods of time. For the kinds of companies that we look at, many of the very successful ones that have succeeded over a very long period of time have been misunderstood for very long periods of time. I mean, Amazon, for example, you mentioned, people just thought it was going to be a bookseller, and that's all it can do. And then Jeff Bezos had that visionary mindset of, no, we're going to be much more. He probably had a whole plan laid out in terms of what they were going to do. And even through the process, people misunderstood and probably criticized that, who's going to, I mean, I remember thinking, who's going to buy things online? Like, there's no way. Like, I don't trust buying stuff online. Like, now we buy cars and furniture and everything online without batting an eye. So that's I feel like tends to be. Have you found that tends to be a lot of what makes these disruptors just scale so much?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So, the ingredients are not that complicated. You find a problem that's not well solved, you find a disruptive way to solve that problem in a different way. You go and get a business model that reinforces it. Actually, doing that is really, really difficult. And this idea that we are going to really focus, Jeff Bezos, obsessively on the customer, the problem they're trying to solve, the job they're trying to get done, and then be willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time. Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz had a definition of disruption once that I really like, which is a disruptive idea is a brilliant idea that sounds like a stupid idea the first time you hear it. So the first time you hear about something like Airbnb, you're like, that's crazy. No way is some rando going to sleep on a couch in people's house until it actually does. If it was obvious, it would have already been done. So it's got to be something that breaks from that in some way. And I think the other thing that's just important to remember is even the visionaries don't have perfect ability to spot and articulate sometimes their vision. I had forgotten this. You go back to Steve Jobs and the launch of the iPhone in 2007, what he said was the killer app was not the slick internet browser. It was not the app store because there was no app store. It was the ability to make phone calls. He said the killer app was the ability to make phone calls. And you listen to that, you're like, wow, he was completely wrong. And it required him being convinced to open up the infrastructure and create the App Store for the iPhone really to become the blockbuster success it was. So again, snapshot movie. And in that snapshot, even the smartest of us can sometimes miss things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Also with innovation, so many times we think it's like a lone genius, one founder that's kind of in their, in their basement or in their garage building something and creating something. But you've said that, innovation is a collectively individualistic activity, meaning, there's not just one lone genius or founder. So, how should management kind of build a culture where employees can kind of experience tomorrow, today's, throw spaghetti at the wall, try different things, ensuring that, it's not just the founder's kind of charisma that kind of creates something more.
Yeah, because it's so much more than that is required. Of course, there are geniuses in every story. There is somebody who stands out more than anyone in any story, but it's always a team, village, legion, whatever metaphor you want to use. And what really reinforced this to me was doing research around the printing press. The way I'd always told that story. Here it is. This is a story about the mythical lone inventor. You've got Gutenberg kind of working on his own, coming up with this idea, until you study history and you realize he had a business partner from day one. And Konrad Sasbach showed up with his printing press, and Johann Fuss provided the funding, and Nicholas of Cusa was the customer, blah, blah, blah. There's just a lot of people who are involved in it. So that means as a leader, yes, get the Gutenbergs, but make sure you've got all those other cast of characters there. What does that require? I think the simplest explanation is a culture where it's okay to try things that don't work out. I talked about this in the last book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate. Places like Supercell that has a ritual where every time a gaming development stops, everyone gets together and stops because they say, this isn't going to work. We're going to shut the effort down. Everyone gets together and pops open a bottle of champagne, saying cheers to failure. And what is so powerful about that is it shows everyone that this kind of behavior is rewarded. It's okay to take intelligent risks. It's okay to go and try things because that's the only way we're going to develop as an organization. Organizations that will go and not just tolerate, but celebrate intelligent failure are the sorts of places that you can bet on to create disruptive growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we kind of touched on it a little bit. We're kind of in the messy middle of a massive AI disruption. We're talking a little bit that a lot of industry lines are blurring. Things are advancing exponentially. You kind of warned in your book too that, and you mentioned it a little earlier, that disruption casts a shadow. So what kind of conflict and messiness, the societal battle resulted from the branding of jaywalkers during the Model T era, and must kind of leaders kind of prepare for as AI accelerates?
You've given me the nod to tell my favorite story from the book, or at least
Excellent.
one of my favorite stories. So, the jaywalker hint that you heard there. So let me tell you the brief story and then bring it to present day. 1920s, Henry Ford had achieved his vision, the car for the multitudes. The Model T, which started at about $30,000 in today's terms, was down to $5,000. Sales were through the roof. Good for many people, but bad if you lived in a city because cities were designed not for cars, but for people and horses. And you sadly had accidents, injuries, and fatalities. All sorts of things had to happen to get through this messy middle period. We needed to have technologies like traffic lights. We needed to have norms like this is what you do for right of way. We needed to have laws like driver's license. And we needed to have the PR battle between the jaywalkers and the flivver boobs. What's that? Well, you had two sides. You had the motorists, the pedestrians. The motorists said it is the pedestrians' problem. They're wandering aimlessly into the street. Let's brand them jaywalkers. Jay is a country bumpkin, walker, kind of obvious. They got the Boy Scouts to give out little cards saying, don't be a jaywalker crossing these designated areas. The pedestrians fought back. They tried to brand the motorist flivver boobs, Flivverboob. Flivver is old time slang for a car. And boob, well, that's kind of obvious. You know who won this battle? You type in flivver boob, you get a red squiggle underneath the word. The word does no longer is in the lexicon. 1924, a New York magistrate said, we now know 80% of the traffic incidents are caused by pedestrians. So onwards we go. What does this matter about today? Well, we are in the messy middle of AI. And the thing I really worry about is there's a big push to say hands off. Let's just let the market work through everything. Let's let the technology work through everything. Let's remember, to get through the messy middle of automobiles, we needed norms, we needed laws, we needed technologies that provided boundaries, that provided barriers, that said you can't do and you can do. I think history says we might need the same thing for AI. If we don't, there's going to potentially be some really bad things that happen. So it's, I think, an interesting thing to reflect on.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because the pace with which AI is developing is much faster than the way the vehicles developed, with much more implication on society as a whole in terms of anything and everything that we do. So it's definitely, it's almost like having the frameworks to make sure that's being developed properly.
No, you're exactly right. And, you know, one of my favorite futurists, Bob Johansson, he's got a book that's coming out in coming out in October, The Edge of Chaos, which, depending on when you air this, it might have already come out. I don't know. But you could edit this as you see fit. But navigating the edge of chaos. And he and his co-authors say we are no longer in a VUCA world that's so yesterday. It's not volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We're now in a Bani world, Bani, that's brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? And he says, in a world like this, particularly with AI that's changing so fast, we don't need guardrails because you can't know what they are. Instead, the metaphor that they use in the book is we need bounce ropes, like you have in a wrestling ring. So yes, there are some firm posts, there are some edges, but then the ropes themselves, they're flexible. You can actually use them as part of the competition, but they still define the surface area for how the game is being played. So what exactly bounce ropes would look like for AI, smarter people than me would know that, but I really like that metaphor in a fast changing world.
Yeah, you know, so like with all the overwhelming information, you know, kind of threatening, you know, systemic shutdown, you know, is John Keats's, you know, concept of negative capability kind of a ultimate superpower for organizational leaders and long-term investors today?
I think so. And, you know, that's one of the themes that I think I will explore in more depth in the next book. So the idea, negative capability, John Keats coined it in a letter in the 1810s, talking about the superpower of the poet to be in mysteries, uncertainties, and doubt without irritable reaching after fact and reason. And the idea is, in a world where it is so easy to feel overwhelmed, how do you press pause, step back, make sense, and say, that's the thing that matters. And none of this other stuff does. And sometimes realize the best thing to do is to not do anything. I'm working on a paper that has a good origin story. It is co-authored by Wendy Smith, who's the leading thinker on paradoxes, and Dr. James Naples, who is an ear and nose and throat surgeon that I met because he was about to perform surgery on me. And I was reading an issue of the Harvard Business Review. We started talking about things. It turned out we had common research interests. So my surgeon has turned into my co-author. The idea here is, in surgery, sometimes you are taught to tell the patient the best thing to do is not to operate. Or sometimes it's to go and do an exploratory surgery where we're going to do something small to figure out what else we could do. The uncertainty that feels paralyzing, that's the thing that opens up new opportunities. And we feel like we want to reduce uncertainty, but sometimes we want to wade right into it because that's what shows us new ways to prosper.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I definitely want to touch on the one of my favorite stories in your book was the Pampers story. My kids are relatively older now, but that story made me think back a lot on when they're kids, and like the rule as a parent was you get Pampers diapers and you get Huggies wipes. That's like the combination that you go for. And I was pleasantly surprised that you had Pampers as one of your chapters in there. And when we talk about a lot of companies that we look at here, we like strong kind of consumer appeals. It's the way we invest is we look out into the world and we see what are consumers buying, what are they using, what's helping them live their lives or making their lives better, and it's kind of easier to grasp than the really nitty gritty technology stuff that's out there. You highlight Pampers, which became Procter and Gamble's first $10 billion brand. It wasn't just a nice to have, convenience for wealthy parents. It was kind of a must have enabler for working class families. You had the story about, a mother going like being able to, use the diapers and not have to go wash the cloth diapers at a laundromat, and then put themselves at risk because they're not in a great neighborhood. So, can investors spot that critical moment when a product kind of shifts from being a limited convenience to a kind of a mass market enabler? And, what signal kind of shows us the company's found that deep kind of behavioral change for growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are all sorts of signals as you go through the Pamper story that it was in the right or hunting in the right area. So, the very short version of the story in 1956, Bob Duncan gets a tap on the shoulder, asked to go and pioneer the disposable diaper market for Procter and Gamble. The market existed. 80% of homes in the United States had at least one disposable diaper, but they only made up 1% of diaper changes. Okay, there's a really big signal. There is a deeply held problem that people have that's not well solved. That was really important because it allowed P&G to persist through a run of failures. They had a failed test market in 1958 because the technology wasn't right. They did the test market in Texas in August. It was a two-part diaper that had plastic around it. One researcher said, maybe we should not have been surprised that subjecting children to a Turkish bath is not the best thing in the world. 1960 and 62, they didn't have the pricing right. 1964, they didn't have the marketing right. So they were wrong about many things, but they were correct in the ultimate vision. We saw 80% of people buying it, but they weren't using it. That was a clear signal. And then the surprise that you mentioned, they were wrong about another thing. They thought it was going to go and be something that was grabbed by the wealthy consumers who wanted the convenience. As you mentioned, it was working class consumers who say, now I have the most important gift that I can possibly have, the gift of time. With that extra time, I can go and work more, I can earn more money, blah, 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 blah. That's another tipping point or tip off. When you are able to give people a precious gift, when you see things that currently are complicated and expensive, and you have to go to centralized locations, and people still do it because they have no choice, and you make it something that's easy and accessible and affordable for people to do, that's the core pattern of disruptive change. You really see that. You say, this has got great growth potential. As I think about the in-process disruptions I name-checked in the conclusion of the book, smart health is one I keep coming back to. I remember early in my consulting career, the signs are all there. 20 years ago, you can see people are really hungry for simpler, more affordable solutions that allow them to not treat diseases, but prevent them from ever happening. The technology 20 years ago just wasn't there. It's still not there, but it's getting awfully close. When you combine things like artificial intelligence with smart connected devices, the ability to really transform the way that people manage their health, I think is getting really close, and I think has the potential for massive growth.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about some of those new wave of epic disruptions that you talked about at the end of the book as well. One thing I did want to touch on too is disruption isn't just limited to the products. We've talked a lot about specific products. It can be like a systemic disruption. You talked about Florence Nightingale, and this was an interesting. Well, I have a lot of friends that are doctors, and one of the stories I remember hearing about is, and it sounds so simple. You go to a hospital, get treated, and you assume, all right, it's going to be clean, it's going to be sterilized. You don't have to worry about going to a hospital and being unsafe, medically. But that wasn't the case back in the day. It was, it was the hospital conditions that was causing more injuries and sicknesses. So it's almost better not to go to the hospital. And because of, Florence Nightingale's disruption, it became a systemic thing where this was more important and taken seriously, and it helped, not just that situation, but also healthcare in general in the future. So, love for you to talk a little bit more about that story, because I don't think people know about that as much.
I agree, and I didn't know it. Florence Nightingale, I associated with the lady with the lamp and a kind, caring nurse, and she was that and so much more. So the experience she had, it was in the Scutari Hospital during the Crimean War, where she gets there in the 1850s and observes exactly what you described: squalid conditions. There's foul air. There's open sewage. And it becomes very clear that the most dangerous place to be if you're a soldier is not on the battlefield, it's in the hospital. So she sends a telegram back to London, says, send a squad to clean the hospital up. They do it. The rate of infectious disease transmission goes way down. She goes back to London. She meets with the Queen. The Queen commissions a royal commission to look into the sanitary conditions in hospitals. Nightingale then partners with William Farr, who heads the General Registry Office, and they do data analytics and visualization, things that feel incredibly modern for the work that they did in the 1850s, and came up with these amazing visuals. One is called a polar area chart that one historian said had interocularity, which was a word that I learned while researching this book, meaning it hits you between the eyes. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The hospital was the worst place to be until they did some basic things, and then it was a better place to be than the battlefield. So this raises awareness about the problem. Florence Nightingale then, 1858, the polar area chart comes up. 1859, she writes the book Notes on Nursing. Here's everyday tips for normal people to practice good habits. 1860, the first training hospital for nurses opens up. Nightingales then fly throughout the world. 1875, sometimes these things take time, the UK passed a General Health Act that said we're going to have many things that we take for granted today, like proper removal and treatment of sewage and good light and air and so on. And life expectancies began shooting up. You can't credit Florence Nightingale for all of that, but you can credit her for a lot of it. And I think the thing this really highlights is there's no real technology in this. This is a new way to analyze data, communicate that data, write out simple ideas, and train a broader population to do things that ended up having this massive societal impact. Anyone could do that.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing story.
You might even call it an epic story. How about that?
Yeah, it was an epic story, as all the innovations are in this book. You have so many of these different 11 that you talk about, but near the end you talk a lot about kind of future technologies, robotics, smart health, which you just mentioned, autonomous vehicles, clean tech. Disruption kind of takes things that are complicated and expensive, makes them kind of simple and affordable to be more accessible to to the broader masses. Where are you kind of seeing most of the exciting edges in fields that they're making this possible?
I think the thing that's interesting is there are so many of them. One way to visualize this, in 1620, Sir Francis Bacon wrote his magnum opus, Novum Organum, and he said, in his view, in world history, there had been three things that changed the state and appearance of the entire world: compass, printing press, gunpowder. Three things. That's over about 2,000 years of recorded history. Today, if you take some of the ones you mentioned, a few others, you could talk about additive manufacturing, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, artificial intelligence. We're at 4, and we've not left the letter A. That's just a sign of just how pervasive all of this is. Underpinning a lot of that is the work that started in Bell Labs in 1947 with the invention of the transistor, which then leads to the modern computing industry, Moore's law, the constant doubling of processing power, which enables us to simultaneously do all of these things. I think of all the things taking place in the conclusion of the book, you have to say artificial intelligence is the one that is clearest to be a Bacon-like state and appearance of entire world, where you will be able to tell your kids or grandkids, I used to do this, and now I do this. You can just, we're still obviously in the early days of this, but you can see cascading changes everywhere. I remember for me, 2022, I kind of transitioned from consulting to teaching. I'm like, great, 20 years of hand-to-hand combat where, if you're a consultant, you're fighting against something, sometimes the problem, sometimes the client, sometimes your own team, whatever. Like, well, I'm going to go to an academic institution, nice and safe and quiet, and not much happens there. 3 months later, ChatGPT comes out, and that's one kind of disruption. And then you've had some political changes that have also had some impact on those of us in higher education. So it's just a reminder there's no safe spaces. Everywhere is dealing with something.
Yeah, yeah, and I imagine you. I don't know about you, but I'm a huge believer in robotics and humanoids, and that's one of the areas that's super fascinating to me, which is AI. It's embodied AI that's going to be another form of AI. Are you in the camp that we'll soon have humanoids helping us with our household chores and other things?
It depends on soon. How do you define the word soon? In
Yeah,
the grand scheme of world history, soon is nothing. But in our finite human history, these things usually take longer than people think. That is, again, a persistent pattern. AI, if we take AI as an example, we think of ChatGPT, OpenAI as being an overnight thing. We forget there's 66 years of development from the 1956 conference at Go Green, Dartmouth College, that starts people really actively exploring artificial intelligence. So do I expect we will see humanoid robots in widespread deployment in my lifetime? Yeah. Do I think it'll have big impact on the life of my kids? Yeah. Do I think it'll be the next 5 years? Probably not. I think it'll be something a little bit after that. But the technologies are getting close enough. I was driving my 14-year-old to a basketball tournament over the weekend. We drove past Boston Dynamics. He's like, "Oh, their best days are behind them." I'm like, "Well, maybe not." But
yeah.
we are going to see, I think, some really, really transformational things in the years ahead. It'll be exciting. And back to disruption casting a shadow. It's important to recognize it'll be scary too. Change is not easy for the human species. So I think we have to go in eyes wide open for all of these things.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing too with disruption and innovation is there's a fine line between it being that and then becoming recognize if it's a disruption or innovation or if it's a fad. One thing you talked about additive manufacturing, the 3D printing stuff for a period of time that was like the next thing. Everyone was really really excited about it. And now some people call it a fad. Maybe it's one of those things where it will come back and maybe the time wasn't right. How can consumers and investors really kind of pinpoint what is a staying innovation or disruption versus more of like just a fad?
Yeah, the metaverse would be another one that would
Hmm.
go in the same category. People would be like, 3 years ago, Facebook changed its name and people are appointing chief metaverse officers, and that's all gotten quiet. But, in both cases, additive manufacturing and things that would be metaverse related technology advances. There are problems out there that those technologies solve in unique ways, and they will both have changes in many industries throughout our lifetime, I think. How do you know? I mean, the thing that you look for really is, number one, to what degree is there a important problem that is not well solved by existing solutions? So it's complicated, expensive, inaccessible to solve it. Number two, to what degree do you have a technology that disrupts that makes it simple, affordable, and effective to solve the problem? Number three, then, and this is really important for things like additive manufacturing, what is the improvement trajectory from today's technology? As we watch that movie, is it something where, hey, it's free riding on the doubling of Moore's law and there's hundreds of billions of dollars being invested, so we know we're going to see big improvements? Or are there fundamental physical limitations that mean, yes, things will get better? It's just going to take a lot longer. This is in one of the footnotes in the book, too. Related to that, there was an analyst who used to work at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Change, Horace Dedu, who did the most comprehensive review, I think, of adoption curves for disruptive innovations. And, everyone thinks everything's going faster. And Horace's answer was yes, but. So, yes, if it is something that is modular, so it plugs right into existing systems, ChatGPT, it goes on your laptop, on your cell phone, whatever,
Yeah.
those things have dramatically accelerated. If it requires the creation of a new value network or ecosystem like additive manufacturing needs to do, or autonomous vehicles, it's one thing to get the technology right, but then you have to deal with all the other stuff around it.
Yeah.
Those things just always take longer. And that, at least in Horace's view, those things had not sped up. So one piece of advice I give my students is go and look at what are some of the rate determining factors for something you're investing in. If
Mhm.
it's a bet on demographics, like there will be more people in Africa in 10 years than there are now, good, go make that bet. If it's a bet on a system changing, be cautious about it. System change just takes a long time. Smart health, for as much as I love it,
Yeah.
healthcare has shown itself to be impervious to almost everything. So a true system level change there is going to be incredibly hard. So again, lots of opportunities still, but you want to go in with that kind of caveat in mind too.
Yeah, I agree. I'm always fascinated by health and wellness, and the adoption of technology in that space is just mind-numbingly slow, and it seems so obvious, but it just doesn't happen. But because, like you said, it's a system change. It's a whole another way of approaching and doing things,
You
which
know, and the other thing too is you have to ask yourself, is it something where we're just doing something new? Or is it something where we have to unlearn something first? I mean,
mm,
I watch the way that my kids use AI. They just pick it up and use it for where it's helpful.
yeah,
I have to first teach myself this is not a search engine. This is not a search engine. So,
yeah,
so I have to go through that. You know, the great example of this is we type on keyboards that were purposefully designed to be inefficient and ineffective. So the QWERTY design for keyboards was meant to slow us down because in old-fashioned typewriters, you type too fast, the keys get stuck. I don't know about you, but I have not used an old-fashioned typewriter since I was doing my college applications in 1991. Yet this inefficient design has persisted because too many of us would have to unlearn the old and learn the new. And we say, you know what? Good enough. So, you know, you have to ask that question too.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Scott, this has been fantastic. I kind of reminds us, whether you're building a company or managing a portfolio, success requires a growth mindset. Welcoming anomalies, realizing kind of like the next great growth businesses often start with looking small, insignificant, even laughable, but they can become something huge and massive disruptors in our life and world. So, for our Motley Fool members, where can they find your book, and how can they connect with you?
The book is available on all major retail channels. You can learn more about it at epicdisruptions.com. And LinkedIn is the social network that I like to hang out on.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Scott, and much success for your book.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.